Hey everybody, Jake here from Bearded Gear. I am finally ready to do my full review on the Gen 4 Koenig Arius. I wanted to be very fair about this review and not just do it right when I got the knife. Even though I owned a Gen 3 Arius, I wanted to make sure I put this knife particularly through its paces and made sure that I was reviewing based on the knife that is in hand and that I'm owning and using. So this knife, my goodness, I love it. It's just such a fantastic knife. Everything a knife should be and should do, this knife excels at it, and then it does so much more. When you think about what a knife should do, it should cut, right? It should cut reliably, it should cut well, it should cut a variety of materials, and this knife does that. This knife is not a toy. It's not just pocket jewelry. It's nothing of the sort. As I have been using this knife, and I've been making myself really use this knife, if you haven't seen me stick it in a tree, you should watch that video. I'll link it down below. This knife goes through every piece of material that I have chosen to put it through, which would be all of the normal EDC stuff: cardboard, paper, wood, tape, paracord, rope, all of that kind of stuff. It just eats it up. Done great. And then I've used it a little bit for harder use stuff, going through like brush on trails and sticking it in that tree, and I tried feather sticking with it just to do it. It's fantastic at all of that stuff. The reason I think that this knife is such a good cutter, when I really break it down, is because of this hollow grind. This is a nice thick blade stock. I don't know what the thickness is. I feel like it's thicker than my PM2, if that gives you any reference. I'm sure you could look it up. But this hollow grind is tall, and it gets nice and thin, like noticeably thin behind the edge, but not so thin it would worry you for hard use tasks either. It's like right in that sweet spot of being really slicey without being weak. I don't have any like indication that this would flex on me or anything like that. It's just really well ground, and it stays thin pretty well up that hollow grind. Like the depth of the hollow grind seems to come in and max out like here, and then we've just got all of this spot down here where it stays nice and thin. Even up to the tip, it still feels pretty thin behind the edge, but it's profiled really well. I mean, I stuck this into a really hard tree, and it didn't have any deformation whatsoever on this tip. The handle as well makes this knife just feel great to use and cut with. It is one of the most perfect ergonomic handles for my hand that I have ever felt on a knife. I think I mentioned when I unboxed this handle feels just like it did on my Gen 3. It's like it's molten. It's like it just melts into my hand. It almost feels like it's made of clay and has like a little bit of give to just fill all of the pockets of my hand just right and not poke or jab me anywhere. I love the shape of this handle. I love that I've got this nice kind of curve in here that locks my two foremost fingers in, and then it swells back here so the knife can't go forward. I've got this kind of guard from the flipper tab here so the knife can't go backward. This spot for my thumb where it lands right here on this flat section is just, oh, I love it. It feels so good. This knife is decent in reverse grip. The one thing that I don't love about this knife in reverse grip is I like to put my thumb on top, and this isn't a great spot to put my thumb. But if I orient my thumb right here on that little bit of jimping, which feels like that's kind of what it's for, then it feels great. So I just have to recalibrate and put my thumb there instead of here. But yeah, it's comfortable in reverse grip, comfortable in draw cut reverse grip if for some reason you do that a lot. Great in hammer grip, great in saber grip. I mean, great in forward draw cut. It feels fantastic, which is probably, I don't know, like before I had this knife, I wouldn't have thought it was that good ergonomically, especially in a variety of grips. Like, it seems like it would be one-dimensionally good. Like in a saber grip, yeah, that's how it's supposed to make sense. But other than that, it probably kind of falls apart because this handle isn't that neutral. It's shaped. But the shape is just so well thought out. The chamfers are perfect. Everything about this knife is softened and it feels great. It's money. I really love it. I'm going to switch to the other side of the camera to kind of talk a little bit more in depth about this knife and my experiences with it. But I guess lastly, while I've got it here right in front of the camera, I'll show as well. The hardware on this knife is fantastic. I did swap these screws. I have a video up on that as well. I ordered them from Blades We Love, and they were like 15 bucks for some blue anodized screws. So they match the backspacer perfectly. I think they look great. I had blue screws that I got from Koenig on my last one, and they were a lot more than 15 bucks. So stoked that I got these for so cheap and they fit and work. The backspacer is gorgeous. It's really well done titanium. I love the way that it feels integrated as part of the shape of the knife, but it does have a spot for a lanyard. If you're one of those people who likes to have lanyards on knives, I'm not in that camp, but the placement of that doesn't bother me, having it there. Yeah, this knife is just fantastic. The clip works great. The visual presentation of the clip, I think it looks amazing, but it's also really great going in and out of pocket. It's got great retention. It's certainly not deep carry, but this knife is one that I don't mind people seeing that I'm carrying. In fact, I kind of hope they notice, because I love that I own an Arius. Anywho, I've rambled enough while having it close, so I'm going to go ahead and spin the camera around and show you me talking about the knife. All right, so I've already said a lot about this knife because I've made a couple of videos about it. I made a video of me unboxing it. I made a video of me kind of talking about my philosophy of use and how this time I'm not going to miss out on owning an Arius by not using it. And I stuck it in a tree in that video. And then I did a video quickly on the swapping of this hardware. But I'm just going to kind of put everything all into one. This is my full review. So let me start by saying this. The first Arius that I had was a Gen 3. It was essentially the same spec as this knife, except this one has satin flats, the other one did not. The other one had this same kind of, I don't know what they call it, it's like a blasted finish on the, how I've got it here, on the grinds and in the swedge, but this one has satin flats, that one did not. Other than that, they were both kind of plain Jane Ariuses, Arii, I don't know how you say multiple Ariuses. They were both titanium scales, milled out internally for weight reduction. Both had the blue backspacer. Both came with satin hardware. I switched to blue hardware in both. Same pocket clip, all that. Now, the only updates that they've made for Gen 4 are, I guess, some of the chamfering is slightly different, although it doesn't feel different to me. I think the way they cut the lock bar is a little bit different. That I do notice, and I'll talk about that. At least I think that's something that my buddy who works there said they changed. But the most noticeable thing is the detent is remarkably different on this one from how it was on my Gen 3. My Gen 3, I think, was one of the stiffer ones that they made. The detent was really, really sharp and really crisp, but it was a little bit difficult to spidey flick. And I like to spidey flick knives. If you haven't noticed, middle finger flipping knives out is in my top 2 ways of deploying a knife. It might be my number 1. I just love opening knives that way. It makes sense the way it places my hand, and it's fun, and I like to fidget, and so there you have it. But this one, the detent is so much lighter. Like, this detent feels like it's half the amount of pressure needed to break compared to the last one. The last one was almost a little too rough for spidey flicking. It worked, but it was like kind of taxing on my fingernail at the end of the day. This one, all day long, it's just buttery to come out, and it works so well whether I'm using the flipper, whether I'm using my middle finger. Nothing about this knife feels harsh or crisp. Everything feels light and airy and really well dialed in, because this detent still breaks super clean. It's not like it's sloppy. It's not like it's so light that the flipper ever doesn't deploy the knife fully. It's not like it's still not rocketing out. I mean, this knife deploys perfectly, in my opinion, and it doesn't need a super hard detent to do that. I feel like some knives kind of cheat and have a really stiff detent, and then it makes it seem like they're almost an auto with how hard they flip out. that's just because it has a really hard detent. You're putting so much pressure on it. This one, it's not about the pressure. It's about how well dialed it is and how smooth this action is. And you can feel that when you play with this knife. On top of that, the lock bar on my first one, if I had my fingers on the lock bar like this, kind of pressed down on it, and went to use the flipper tab, it would not open. It was locked shut because of the pressure that I was putting on there. On this one, I can literally put pressure on there and it still deploys reliably, and it hardly feels any stiffer. I have to like really be pressing on there to even feel the difference I'm making, which is really cool. I like that I don't have to worry about where my fingers are to deploy this one. So whatever they did to enhance the lock bar and the detent on the Gen 4, to me, the evidence is abundant and I can feel it, and it's great. Next thing I would say is, I guess let's talk about, I already talked about ergos in front of the camera. I can't say enough good about these ergos. This is my favorite folding knife to hold and to like actually cut with, in terms of how it fits my hand and the way it goes through material, that I've ever owned, that I've ever used, period. This knife works so well for me as an actual like user pocket knife, which is just awesome, especially because it looks so freaking cool. Yeah, I feel like a lot of knives focus on one or the other. They either focus on looks, and you kind of have to forgive the ergonomics because it's so cool looking, or they do the other one and they focus so much on ergos that the knife's kind of ugly. Like, if you've watched my reviews on the Spidey Chef, I was not overly kind to the looks on the Spidey Chef because I don't think it's a very pretty knife at the end of the day, but that knife feels like it was designed ergonomically and not for aesthetics. This knife kind of just blows both of those out of the water. It's gorgeous in my opinion. I love the way this knife looks. I was immediately drawn to this knife the first time I ever saw a picture of it. I wanted one because I think it looks really cool. And then the ergos and the use are actually phenomenal. Like it blows me away that they're able to do both so well on here. Everything on this knife feels really well thought out. You can see how much care they put into their knives at Koenig when you get closer to this knife. Some knives, they look good from far, but they're far from good. Like the closer you get to them, the more they kind of fall apart. This knife is not that way. The closer you get to it, the more all of the details shine on it. Every single edge, every single nook and cranny of this knife has been deliberately machined, and it's just really well thought out. On top of that, every time I pick up this knife, even now that I have one again, and I've carried it almost every day, every time I pick it up, grab it out of my knife box in the morning to put it into my pocket, I'm always shocked by how light it is, because it's pretty thick blade stock, pretty thick slabs of titanium for handle material. We've got a milled titanium clip, we've got a titanium backspacer. It's not like titanium's an overly heavy metal, but when you've got this much of it, it seems like it should be heavy, right? We've got this big slab of M390 as a blade. This knife is not small, but the internal milling is so extensive on here that this knife, it's just like, it feels like it defies gravity a little bit when I pick it up. You might think I'm being too nice to this knife, by the way, as I'm going through this, but I'm just being as honest as I possibly can. This is the knife I love most in the world that I've ever experienced. Yeah, that internal milling is nuts. It's just really well done. They've done it as well so that the balance of the knife is still really good. It's not like it's overly blade heavy. It's not overly handle heavy. It feels very neutral where it sits in your hand. It's just excellent. Yeah, I'm floored by how much I love the Koenig Arius. It's just the perfect knife, in my opinion. I don't think there's anything about this knife that I would change. I really don't. That being said, there is a mini Arius right around the corner that I believe is going to have a 3-inch blade, whereas this one's 3.5. So will I own one of those? Probably. Maybe after having a smaller one, I'll think this knife should be smaller. Maybe it'll be like the bug out and the mini bug out, and I'll just love this one. I imagine with how fantastic this is and with how amazing Koenig is at making knives, I'm probably going to love the mini one as well. But that doesn't mean that I don't think this knife is perfect. It's a weird term to call a knife perfect, because what my definition of is perfect is probably wildly different from a lot of other people who are also super into knives as a hobby. The perfect knife doesn't exist for the same two people, I don't think. The likelihood that all of your tastes line up perfectly with mine is it's got to be really rare. Um, that being said, for my purposes, for what I look for in a knife, for what I enjoy in a knife, for the way I like to use my knives, this knife to me is as perfect as I've ever found. Maybe someday I'll find something I like more and it'll change my definitions. But one of the coolest things about the Arius to me is that it was a grail for me. Before I got my Gen 3, I wanted it for a really long time. And it was more than I was willing to spend on a knife for a really long time. I still kind of think, in a lot of ways, you stop getting more for your money after a certain point in terms of materials and like the ingredients involved in a knife. So, could I get all of these materials that make this knife for a lot cheaper? Absolutely. Totally. Even US made, I could probably get a knife made of these same materials for cheaper. But the way that they use these materials, I didn't understand until I held this knife. The difference between this knife and a $300 knife made of the same materials. This knife was, I think I paid $575 for it. I'm pretty sure that was retail. I bought it secondary though. Let's call it $600 even. If this knife is twice as much as a production knife that is using the same materials made here in the US, or at least comparable materials, whatever way you want to slice it, if this is twice as much, I have no reservations about this knife being worth every penny of being twice as much as another knife after holding this one and using it and feeling it, because the evidence is just abundantly clear. Once you've had this knife in hand, once you've played with that action, once you have used it and cut with it especially, I mean, it's butter. It's so good. It's so smooth. It's so well executed. It is an excellent, excellent knife. So this go around, like I've said, this is my Arius. I'm going to use it. I'm going to enjoy it. I've been having so much fun with it. And I'm really, really glad that I got another one. It makes me want to just buy more Koenigs. I want to get a mini Goblin. I've held one but haven't owned one. I want to get a mini Arius as soon as they come out. I love what they're doing. And this knife it's my favorite, not just for a reason, but for a lot of reasons. So I hope that comes through. And as I've talked about it, I've made it make a little more sense for those of you who wonder about this knife. And yeah, if there's a knife that fits what I'm looking for, this is it. So that's the Koenig Arius.